Last time, we looked at the beginnings of the Touhou series with the first 5 games released on the PC-98. It was an interesting time for sure, back when Sun had a different idea for his games and took things more casually, without delving much into the details. However, while the PC-98 games did garner some popularity during that time, the truth is the PC-98 itself was already on its last legs by the time Sun released these games. Most people were making the jump to Windows systems by the late 90s. It was more powerful, its tools allowed for more freedom and possibilities, and it was generally more consumer-friendly. And eventually, Sun would also decide to follow suit. After the 5th game Mystic Square was released in 1998, Touhou would go into a bit of a hiatus for a couple years. The new millennium came around, Sun was out of university and now working as a programmer at Taito, and in 2002 he decided to return to the doujin scene with the game that would mark a turning point for the series. Released on August 11, 2002, Embodiment of Scarlet Devil was the first Touhou game developed for Windows systems, while also being kind of a soft reboot for the series. It was also the first game released under Sun's own circle, Team Shanghai Alice. But most importantly for me, it was here where my journey through Touhou truly began. Like I mentioned in the previous video, after Story of Eastern Wonderland, I jumped directly to the Windows games, and this was the one that did it for me. Granted, I was always a bit biased because the way I found out about Touhou was through its music and very tasteful videos, and this game was one that came up very often. This is the most popular Touhou game bar none, with a lot of fan content being produced for this game alone, which in and of itself causes it to be the first exposure people have to the series, and so the cycle repeats, forever. Literally every single character here still has a big presence in the community. All the members of the Scarlet Devil Mansion, Chirno and Rumia, even the 2 mid-bosses that Sun clearly didn't think much of were given names by the fans, even if those names are literally Great Fairy and Small Devil. As for the series itself, I think the most relevant character to come out of this game is Isayoi Sakuya, who would be playable in a few other games afterwards. What, you thought it was gonna be her? This is Flandra Scarlet. She's the extra boss of this game and that's about it. The amount of content you see of her in the community will lead you to believe she's a really important character, but no, not really. And that goes for most of the OST cast, to be honest. But I think it's that overwhelming presence in the community that sort of creates a feedback loop with the people that discover the series through it, and that manages to still keep this game and its characters alive even after all these years. Now, how that surge in popularity happened in the first place is still unclear to me. There are many takes on the matter, from accessibility to just pure luck, to the fact that this game is unique in various ways, and also the true first game, as I'll explain later. It was kind of a transition between the PC-98 way of doing things and Sun's more detailed stuff that we start seeing very soon. In fact, I've seen people go as far as to call it the last PC-98 game instead of the first Windows game, because in terms of writing, it does share a lot more with the past entries, with a lighthearted and humorous tone. EOST also brings an interesting mix of Western and Eastern aesthetics, and it was kind of an intended joke by Sun. The word Touhou means Eastern direction, so he made a game about a Western-style vampire. What a land! That said, this game does bring improvements not only to the story, but also the gameplay and of course, the graphics and sound department. For the first time, the story was a little bit more defined, instead of "oh, there are ghosts, we gotta stop the ghosts, Trans Haunted, you know the deal." Though it's still very lighthearted in its execution, with many jokes and references to other media. The characters also had a bit more personality, not only in the way they're written, but their designs as well. Even if they were still pretty shallow at the time, let's be real here. Here's where Sun would start consistently writing profiles for them like he once did in Phantasmagoria Out in Dream, offering some more details and making them feel more like actual characters and less like roadblocks that are just there to be defeated. And again, Sokyo is actually stated to be the main setting now, finally. World building was still relatively vague in this early Windows era of games, but there's definitely more to see here than in PC-98. I did mention that it was a soft reboot for the series, and that's actually kinda hard to explain. Most of the story elements and characters established in the PC-98 era are gone now, though according to Sun, they did still happen, and while not often, those events are occasionally referenced in this new canon. Basically, PC-98 is on an "it's canon until it isn't" basis, don't think about it too much. There's a new coat of paint that makes everything stand out, backgrounds are now more detailed, and locations more varied. The default fodder enemies are now fairies, instead of those goofy looking ghosts we see in the PC-98, and honestly, kind of a shame. I'm gonna miss those guys, I love them. The music was no longer limited to chiptune, of course. This is where Tsun would start using the Edirol SD90 for his music, along this continued sound module that contains many of the sounds that would become iconic for the series, like that trumpet you hear in so many Touhou songs. This was originally not gonna be the case though, as Tsun initially composed the music of the OST with the Roland SC88 Pro, a synthesizer that comes up a lot when talking about video game music from these days, and for a while his games would even contain the MIDI files meant to be played on that module. But after getting an SD90, he rearranged all the songs using that instead, probably because not everyone had an SD88 to play the songs properly. The music is also mixed to sound a little bit detuned. This is the only time Tsun did this for a soundtrack, but I'm a big fan of the style. Combined with the soul synth sounds, it gives it that nostalgic, almost mystic feeling, a relic of a bygone era. Fun fact about the music actually, Tsun originally tried to sign up as a dodging music circle called Shanghai Alice Ensemble, but got rejected, prompting him to start working on this game. As for the gameplay, the dream mechanic from the last two games is now gone, which, I mean, it was pretty inconsequential anyways, so it isn't that big of a deal. But something far more useful was introduced in its place, the point of collection near the top of the screen. If you go there at full power, you will automatically collect all the items on screen, encouraging a more high-risk, high-reward playstyle. We go back to just Raymond and Marisa as playable characters, working pretty much the same as it did in Lotus Land Story, but now rocking some new designs. And now, each shot type also has a unique bomb, giving way to two iconic moves, Raymond's Fantasy Seal and Marisa's Master Spark. There's even different endings depending on which shot you use. Once again though, playing on easy locks you out of the final stage. This will be the last time Tsun was on his bullshit though, don't worry. But by far the most important change was the addition of spell cards. Previously, bosses went through their phases pretty quickly, usually without much variation between each one. Not to mention, the PC98 games focused more on very fast and often random bullet spreads, requiring quick reflexes to get through them. This happens in the Windows games too, but now with spell cards we begin to see more unique pattern-based attacks that are easier to recognize, making for a much smoother and memorable experience. Every boss has a set amount of them and each one has a time limit. If beating within that time limit without dying or bombing, the spell card is captured, granting a much higher score bonus. These spell cards also act as a vehicle for the character's personalities and abilities. There's always a lot of care and attention put into these and they can look really pretty. I think one of the best examples would be Patchouli Knowledge. Her shtick is that she can use elemental magic, and so, all of her spell cards represent one of those elements, going even further to combine two elements for some of them. Not to mention, you get to see a different set of these depending on the character and shot type you're using. Another great example is Sakuya. She can stop time, her spell cards stop you on your tracks. Is it annoying? Yes it is. But it's fun and looks really fucking cool, that's what matters in the end. Spell cards even serve to give extra stages a much more distinctive feel now. They aren't just harder than usual stages anymore, now the boss's attacks are considerably more gimmicky than anything else you find in the main game. The spell card system was a really genius idea that makes the games that much more interesting to play and breathes new life into a genre that's otherwise pretty straightforward. I will admit that part of why I liked this game so much at first is because I had been exposed to the characters and music beforehand, so there was some familiarity that definitely helped make it click for me. But this was also a new era for Touhou that obviously became the most prevalent one, and the cost of leaving the PC98 games almost completely forgotten. Which is a bit sad to me in a way. There are some interesting things in those games that I would have loved to see explored further, so it's a shame that it got dropped just like that. Well, that's what I think nowadays. At the time, I was eager to discover more of this Touhou series, and for that, this was definitely the place to be. So after getting all I could from Embodiment of Scarlet Devil, I moved on to the next game in this era. Touhou Yo-Yo-Mu Perfect Cherry Blossom, the 7th entry released a year after the last one, on August 17th, 2003. Winter has been dragging on for too long, prompting our protagonist to seek out the cause, this time adding Sakuya from the previous game to the roster. As such, this game goes for a very wintry scene, which is reflected perfectly in both the graphics and music, and even the new characters I would say. This is where the writing starts getting a bit more concrete, with the in-game dialogue being more focused on the plot at hand than in previous entries. Throughout the game we learn that the reason for this long winter is due to Kompa Kuyomu, a half-human, half-phantom gardener gathering all the essence of spring at the request of her mistress Sagyo Yuyuko, the ghost princess of the Netherworld. The plan was to use that spring to revive the Sagyo Ayakashi, a yokai cherry tree residing in the Netherworld that had been sealed so it may never bloom again. Compared to what we've been getting previously, this is beginning to look more like an actual story now, instead of just an excuse for the games to happen. I think a big problem is that a lot of things are still only told through the external profiles Tsun writes for his characters, like take a look at the one for Yuyuko. Here we learn that she read about someone buried under the Sagyo Ayakashi, and that breaking the seal on the tree would cause him to be resurrected, completely unaware that the body lying there was none other than her own. And that's only part of it, but it already shows that Sun now cares way more about writing an engaging story for the games and elaborating on the characters and their world. It's just a shame that a lot of it can only be communicated in this way because the game's format doesn't allow for more. By the way, we also get the first reference to PC-98 in the form of Alice Margatroyd, who is not supposed to be the same Alice from Mystic Square, but she's obviously inspired by her. The music is also a bit of a step up from the previous game. Here Sun would start implementing other instruments from different sources aside from the SC90, with the new sounds allowing for more possibilities and giving this soundtrack quite a different feel from the last one, and that would repeat in every game honestly. While all the music from Touhou shares a common style that is instantly recognizable, the soundtrack of every game feels unique in its own way, be it due to a different sound palette that completely changes the feel of the song, different mixing techniques, or simply at a compositional level as Sun gained more experience and evolved his style. In terms of gameplay, there have been a few changes. For starters, the controls are a bit more responsive and smooth now, and overall it just feels better to play than the last game. Getting extra lives is no longer tied to score, but rather you get them by collecting a certain amount of point items, which is a little bit more consistent to pull off. Focusing now changes your shot completely, usually to a more, well, focused one. You can also now see your hitbox while focused, and holy shit, this took so long to implement. Yeah, the hitbox has always been way smaller than what the sprite suggests, but this is the first time you can actually see it, and having that visual reference really helps out a lot with dodging, believe it or not. Another nice addition is the marker at the bottom of the screen, letting you see where the boss is without having to constantly snap your view to the top. By the way, remember rank? That thing that made the bullets go faster? This is the last game where it appears, and again, it's so inconsequential that it might as well never have been there in the first place. From now on, every game would have its own unique gimmick, with some being more intrusive than others. This time we have the cherry system, which is actually really complicated, but most of it only affects scoring, so I'm only gonna talk about the actual effect it has on gameplay. This cherry plus meter at the bottom left corner of the screen goes up as you shoot things. Once it reaches 50,000, it triggers the supernatural border, acting as a shield for any kind of damage for about 9 seconds. It's a neat mechanic that can save you in a pinch a few times, and that you don't really have to worry about since it happens just by playing the game normally. Let's talk about the extra stage real quick because things are a bit different in this game. You have your regular extra unlocked after getting a 1cc in the main game, but it's looking a little bland. This is considered by many to be the easiest extra stage in the series, which makes it an excellent choice for being the first one you tackle. However, that low difficulty, coupled with its boss Yakumo Ran, hints that there might be something else going on here. Ran is a Shikigami, which you can think of as a familiar of sorts, so there's gotta be someone that controls her, right? And so there is. By beating the extra stage and capturing 60 spell cards in total, yes, 60 spell cards, you unlock the Phantom stage, which is essentially a harder version of the extra stage. Or it would be more accurate to say that the extra stage is an easier version of this, really. And I bring this up specifically because of the boss you encounter here, the yokai of Banjoris Yakumo Yukari, who is gonna remain one of the most important characters in the series due to her ties with the Hakone Shrine Maidens and her involvement in the very creation of Gensokyo as we know it. At least until she gets replaced by someone else, but there's a long way to go before that happens. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Perfect Cherry Blossom was a great follow-up to EOST, and this is where the Touhou series really started to grow in popularity. Things were finally starting to take some shape, and it seems Sun had a clear idea of where he wanted the series to go, no longer being just funny one-off games with colorful characters, but stories surrounding a concrete world, with characters that actually have some weight to them. And this philosophy would continue into the next game 1 year later, with the release of Touhou Eiyasho Imperishable Night on August 15th, 2004. If I had to pick a game from this early Windows era, it would be this one. Imperishable Night feels like the culmination of Sun's little experiment with Touhou, now that its world was getting a bit more fleshed out. In an interview he mentions that this game would have not been possible without the build-up of the previous two, and yeah, I can see that. It would have been quite the whiplash to just jump from PC-98 to this. But it was not just about the game really. After the release of Perfect Cherry Blossom, Sun had already begun branching into other projects related to the series. Curiosities of Lotus Asia began serialization at the beginning of 2004, a series of short stories that delved more into the characters and other aspects of Gensokyo. Ghostly Field Club released at the end of 2003, a music CD with a story that views the world of Touhou from a different perspective. And along Imperishable Night released the trial version of Immaterial and Missing Power, which would be the first spin-off game made in collaboration with Circle Twilight Frontier. Touhou was becoming sort of a phenomenon and definitely more than just a simple shooting game series. But I'm getting way too ahead of myself here. Let's go back to Imperishable Night and actually talk about what it brought to the series. First off, instead of single playable characters, we have teams. Reimu and Yukari, which I'm sure must have been very confusing for people who didn't play the Phantom stage in the last game, the two magicians Marisa and Alice, Sakuya and Remilia, and from the last game we have Yomu and Yuyuko. Of course, the pattern here is a human, or half-human, paired with a non-human, and it's integral to one of the main gimmicks of the game, the yokai gauge, which is, once again, really complicated to explain and has a negligible effect on casual gameplay, so instead let's talk about the other gimmick, time. The game takes place over one night, starting at 11 PM and advancing 1 hour after every stage. However, if you collect the required amount of time orbs in the stage, it will instead only advance 30 minutes. Getting time is tied to the yokai gauge I mentioned earlier, but chances are you'll just get it by playing normally. It isn't really required to beat the game though. Okay, so if the clock reaches 5 AM before the end of the last stage, you get a game over. But if you play the game completely ignoring any of the gimmicks, you will get there by 4 AM anyways. Unless you continue, since using one also advances the clock 30 minutes, so getting time can give you some leeway in that regard. If you get enough time in a stage, you also get to challenge its boss's last spell, a bonus spell card that is a bit harder and that you cannot bump through. It's not necessary to clear it though. If you get hit, it just ends and you continue as if nothing happened. The playable characters also have access to this last spell, activated in the same way you would use a death bomb, and while that is considerably easier to do in this game, it comes at the cost of using up 2 bombs instead of 1. That said, the regular death bomb is still possible to pull off, but again I wouldn't recommend going for it. Anyways, now that we got through that mess, let's go back to the whole pair-up mechanic because it's, in my opinion, one of the best things ever added to a Touhou game. Not so much for the gameplay. At the end of the day, it's the same as the previous game. Focusing switches to the other character who has a more focused shot. But no, I'm talking about the writing, since having more people present at once allows for more varied and interesting interactions. Not only that, but the dynamic between the members of each team is also explored a little bit, and it's a great way to flesh out the characters even further. This game also has the return of the Reimu v Marisa fight that we last saw in Lotus Land Story, and it's done so much better in this game of course, to the point of it being one of the more iconic moments of the series. I mean, it's not always Reimu and Marisa since other characters also fight them, but you know, that's obviously the main attraction here. But we're not done with the dualities yet, because there's also 2 final bosses here. The first time you go through the game, you'll face Yagokoro 18 at the end, but at your second run, the other culprit Horasan Kaguya will be waiting for you instead. While this is kind of a neat feature, having to play through the same game twice is not something I'm ever hyped about. Not to mention, it's not shared between teams, meaning if you face Kaguya with one team and want to try another one, you have to unlock her path again, and if you wanna see all the endings, you have to beat the game a total of 8 times. Don't worry, this will only get worse later on. Something that becomes way more apparent here is the focus on the eastern side of things, referencing many aspects of folklore, mythos and religion. A good example is the character of Kaguya, based on the Princess Kaguya from the Tale of the Bamboo Cutter, a Japanese folk story. We are also introduced to the Lunarians, a civilization settled on the moon which has some roots in Shintoism. And I mean, yokai have been a thing in previous games, which in Japanese folklore are monsters and other supernatural entities, but now it kinda becomes the default setting for any new character until stated otherwise. Now, I'm not really qualified to talk about this aspect of the series, and at the end of the day, it's not necessary to understand Touhou as a whole. Touhou canon is its own thing. You can look at the different sources if you want some more insight into the concepts or want to theorize about the characters a bit. But it's still important to keep in mind since this is pretty much going to be the series' identity going forward, with almost every character in the later games having some connection to some aspect of Japanese folklore. Imperishable Night also spawned 3 print works that further expand upon the elements introduced. The manga Silent Sinner in Blue and novel Keijin Lunatic Runagate, which both tell the same story from different perspectives and shed some more light into the backgrounds of the characters and the world of the Lunarians. Aside from those, we have In About the Moon and In About the Earth, a young Koma gag manga focused on these new characters, obviously with a very humorous tone. This last one is considered like semi-official though, don't take it too seriously. To close off this section about Imperishable Night, here's something I didn't really know where to fit. Spell practice. A mode that lets you practice the individual spell cards you encounter, which really comes in handy for learning those tough spells that you don't really have much time to figure out during a regular run. It's a great feature that sadly doesn't appear in every game after for some reason. In fact, as we'll see later, it seems like Sun just randomly remembers to add it in some games and then forgets about it completely. But one element unique to this game is the last word, not to be confused with the last spell we covered earlier. Every character, even the playable ones, has a bonus spell card that can only be challenged here. They all have a certain unlock condition that needs to be met before you can try it out though, but they're a nice little extra challenge that you can go for if you want a bit more out of the game. Anyways, that's the end of the original Windows trilogy, but if you read the title, you know there's one more game to talk about. This whole section is often referred to as the classic Windows era to include that last game, but I went with Trilogy because I feel it's these first 3 games that truly represent this era of Touhou best, and they are the ones that brought the most substantial changes to the series. But we gotta be thorough here, so before jumping to the next big part of Touhou's history, we need to talk about Touhou Kaitsuka Phantasmagoria Flower View, released on August 14th, 2005. So you're probably thinking, hey, that name sounds familiar, and you'd be right. It's the same naming convention as Phantasmagoria Team Dream from the PC-98, and that's because this game shares the same gameplay as that one-on-one battles where you send bullets to the opponent, which is great because it means I don't have to talk about that system again. There are a few minor differences, but they don't really change up the gameplay that much. The most notable ones are the ability to focus from the previous games and the lack of bombs. Yep, no bombs. Instead, the way to clear bullets is by using the charge attacks. Level 2 will clear bullets in a small radius around the character, level 3 gets a bigger radius, and level 4 just clears the whole screen. Also Lily White. She was the stage 4 mid-boss in Perfect Cherry Blossom, and now she'll randomly appear as a stage hazard for both players, rewarding some useful items when defeated. And like in the previous game of this kind, there's no bad ending, so you can use O3 continues with no penalty at all, except for score. I think one of the highlights of this game is the dialogue between the characters. There's so much of it, and it's all really good. And that's thanks to the fact that there are 16 different characters to play. You heard that right, 16 playable characters. Unlocking them is a pain though, since it requires completing the game many times, but well, you certainly won't be lacking in options to do that. Most of these are returning characters from previous games, but we do have 5 new ones. Shamei Maruaya, who would go on to become a recurring character throughout the series, even getting her own spin-off titles. Kasami Yuka returning from PC-98, though, as with Alice, it's unclear if they're supposed to be the same character or not. Medicine Melancholy, who's sadly gonna remain one of the most forgotten characters in the community, and our 2 main antagonists this time, Onosuka Komachi and Shiki Eiki. Now Eiki is a Yama, in charge of judging the souls of the deceased to decide where they go after death. She also calls out whoever you're playing as on their bullshit, which leads to some very funny exchanges, while also doing a great job at developing the characters. Again, all the dialogue in here is really good. I highly recommend reading through it on the Touhou wiki if you don't want to go through the ordeal of playing this game over and over. Another very nice detail is that all characters either have new arranged versions of their themes or completely new ones made for this game. And while I'm not a big fan of Sun's style here, it's still amazing to me how much care he puts into the music for anything he works on. Alright, what else is there to say about PoFV? Alright, extra mode. While this game doesn't have an extra stage, it does have an extra mode unlocked after beating the game with every character. You know what, at this point I should mention the unlock codes. Funnily enough, these were not discovered until very recently, but all the Windows games have a way to unlock all the features at once by inputting a code, usually in the results menu where you can see your scores, and they're a lifesaver if you wanna try out one specific feature that would otherwise require hours of gameplay to unlock. Anyways, back to extra mode. Here there's no extra lives, and both you and your opponent start with half an orb of health. The opponent is also invincible for a while, so the objective is to survive until they can finally take damage. Feel free to try this out if you found the main game to be too easy. So I mentioned on the PC-98 video that this style of games are not really my cup of tea. I prefer the more traditional shooter style. That said, there's a small competitive scene surrounding this game, with tournaments being held once in a while, which is honestly amazing to me. There's even a tier list, goddamn. It took me a while to find out this game had such a following behind it. But in any case, we've arrived at the end of this early Windows era. Making the jump to this system was a necessary step if Touhou was ever to become anything, and well, Sun really nailed it. Not only was the gameplay improved tenfold from all the small changes to it, and of course the big change that was the spellcard system, but the writing, the characters, the world, everything is so well defined now in a way that we didn't see in the PC-98 titles, either due to its limitations or because Sun wasn't really interested in doing all this back then. The world of Gensoki really feels alive now. And all of this is gonna be the base upon which the series will continue to grow and evolve. So next time, we'll be taking that step forward, looking at what's sometimes called the modern era of Touhou, a trio of games that definitely began shaking things up a bit. For now, thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel, and stop by my streams on Twitch if you have the time. I go live every day, Monday to Saturday. With that, see you next stream.